Moving on, we're going to talk about Kingdom Plantae in more detail. So section 6.1 just kind of gave an overview of plants and animals and their general characteristics. Now we're going to talk in more detail about the different groups of plants. And this video will focus on the first two groups of plants. This graphic is kind of a nice quick way of remembering what the different groups are and how they're kind of divided up. So Kingdom Plantae, we said, was broken into two main groups. There's non-vascular and vascular plants. And the difference is non-vascular plants don't have vascular tissue. In other words, they don't have those conducting tubes that go up and down through the plant to carry water and nutrients to all the different cells. So this group includes mosses and their relatives, so mosses and liverworts and hornworts. Of the vascular plants, some of them are seedless. So the seedless vascular ones include ferns and their relatives, like whisk ferns and horsetail ferns and club mosses. Some of the vascular plants are seed-bearing plants. So there's two groups of seed-bearing plants. There's gymnosperms and there's angiosperms. Now, sperm means seed. So gymno means naked. So these ones have no protective fleshy coating or vessel that surrounds the seed directly. They include conifers and cycads and ginkgos. And they tend to bear cones that hold their seeds. The angiosperms, on the other hand, angio means vessel, so these ones have a protective vessel around the seed. And so they are the flowering plants that produce a fruit. So we're going to take a closer look in this video at the non-vascular ones, so the mosses and their relatives, and the seedless vascular ones, which are the ferns and their relatives. Like we said, there are four groups of plants that we'll look at. So the mosses and their relatives, ferns and their relatives, and you may even want to write beside them. So the first ones are the non-vascular, and the ferns are the seedless vascular plants. Then we have the cone-bearing plants, which are the gymnosperms, and the flowering plants, which are the angiosperms. So this is kind of a close-up of all four groups, representatives. So the first group are the mosses and their relatives, or the non-vascular plants. And there's three main divisions of these non-vascular plants. There's the mosses, the hornworts, and the liverworts. So the mosses are the bryophytes, or phylum Bryophyta. The hornworts are anthocerophytes, and the liverworts are hepatophytes. And hepato is the term that means liver. So they look like little livers. So mosses and their relatives have no vascular tissue. So because they have no vascular tissue, they tend to be very low to the ground, and they have to live where it's very moist because they don't have roots. They don't have stems, no true root stems or leaves. They have more specialized tissues. So they have little root-like things called rhizoids, but they don't really anchor them very strongly. But it does mean that they can live in, they can grow on rocks. They can grow on things that you wouldn't think they'd normally be able to grow on. Okay. They depend on moisture, so they have to have lots of water around because they don't have conducting tissue. They depend on diffusion and osmosis instead to move water and nutrients between cells. We said earlier that the green plant that we tend to note as being the moss is the gametophyte stage. So the gametophyte is the dominant generation. And because they don't make a seed, they require water so that their gametes don't dry out and so that the sperm can swim to or reach the egg. So they have to have water to get the sperm from the the male part to the female part. They tend to grow in mats of low tangled vegetation that can hold water really well, like a sponge. So the most common of these, and actually the second most diverse of all plants next to the flowering plants, are the mosses. That's kind of surprising in a way, but they are the second most diverse, which is a good point to note. Again, they're found in moist shaded areas. This is a picture of sphagnum. And sphagnum is actually mined here. We call it mine. We have bogs. So we have peat bogs. There's a big one there in Miscush, and there's some up west. And we harvest what's called peat moss. And peat moss is very valuable. It's very absorbent, and it's full of nutrients. So peat moss we buy it to put it in our gardens or in our flower beds, and helps to have other plants grow really well. And it's actually harvested in PEI. It's really neat to go for a walk in a peat bog, because the feeling of the ground is very, very unique. It feels like you're walking on one of the big balloon houses. You kind of sink down in, and sometimes you can get pretty wet. So, good idea to wear rubber boots. This is showing a close-up of the moss. So the bottom part, the green part that we usually see as the moss, is the gametophyte. And then the sporophyte, you'll see, will grow out at certain times of the year. The sporophyte will grow out of the top of the female gametophyte. And we'll understand that a little better when we look at the life cycle. But at the top of the sporophyte is this capsule that will release spores. So this is the sporophyte. Remember, sporophyte's going to make spores, and they'll be made in this little capsule. So you should have this diagram. It's the life cycle of the moss. Okay, so we said there's the sporophyte. It's growing out of the top of the female gametophyte. And it has a capsule that's protected by a little coating. So the sporophyte is diploid, remember. It has 2 copies of chromosomes. Inside of the capsule, meiosis will happen in order to produce haploid spores. So the spores have only 1 copy of chromosomes. The spores will land on the ground somewhere, and they'll germinate to form this little fruiting body called a protonema. So it's a little mass that will grow and then have little buds come off of it, and the buds will grow into male and female gametophytes. Okay, so protonema is an important term here. That's the mass that will form and grow and have little buds come off it that will form the male and female gametophytes. So at the top of the male and female gametophytes would be the parts that produce the egg and the sperm. So at the top of the male plant, or the male gametophyte, would be antheridia. That's plural, so there's more than one of them. One would be called an antheridium, and you'll probably remember this a little better when we learn about the male part of the flower, which is called an anther. Okay, so the antheridium is the male part that produces sperm. At the top of the female one is an archegonium, or archegonia plural, and at the base of them is where the egg would be produced. So water is needed in order to, so you'd have like a drop of water or rain that would allow the sperm to swim to the egg. So the sperm has to get down into where the egg is, and then fertilization will happen, and the zygote will form right in here at the top of the female plant, and then it'll start to divide. So as soon as it forms the zygote, okay, the egg and the sperm chromosomes have come together, so the zygote is diploid. And then it'll undergo mitosis to form the embryo, and it'll grow into the bigger sporophyte out of the top of the female gametophyte. And then it'll continue and happen again. So that is the life cycle. You should watch the animation. I'm not going to show it in the video this time, but the animation is also linked from the website and from Edmodo. But it's a really good one to watch, and then you can see it actually happening. It's a little different than me just talking about it. Okay, so make sure you watch the animation. You could even pause right now and go watch it, because timing is kind of nice. Alright, the second group is the seedless vascular plants. So they have vascular tissue, but they don't produce seeds. And these include the ferns and their relatives. Because they have vascular tissue, they can grow taller than the mosses. And we can have some really tall ferns. They do have true roots, stems, and leaves, but they don't produce seeds. So they still require water for the sperm to reach the egg and to keep the gametes from drying out. The dominant generation, so what we see as being the fern, is the sporophyte. So the only one that has the dominant gametophyte are the mosses and their relatives. They can live in a wider range of environments than the mosses, and they include, I'll show some pictures, they include these guys, so ferns and horsetail ferns and whisk ferns and club mosses. So you have to be careful because these ones sound like they must be mosses, but really they're a type of fern. They're called club mosses. So, the fern life cycle, you'll recognize some of the terms. I'll show you this graphic. This is actually the one that you have, so we'll take a look at it as well. And there's a couple of good animations that you can watch for these ones too. Okay, so here's the sporophyte, the fern that we tend to think of as the fern. And the leaf of the fern has a special name called a frond. You should know that term. Okay, if you were to look on the underside of the leaf, or on the underside of the frond, you would see these little circular, usually yellowish orange, circular things called sori, or a sorus. Each one is a sorus. And in them are clusters of sporangia. And we saw that term when we talked about fungi. So the sporangia, or sporangium singular, are the parts that will make spores. Okay, so remember, the sporophyte's job is to make spores. So meiosis will happen inside of here and produce haploid spores. Okay, so the N is just to remind us they're haploid, half the number of chromosomes. This spores will land and germinate to form a gametophyte. Okay, and the gametophyte, we took a look at this in the earlier video briefly, but the gametophyte is kind of neat. It's a little harp-shaped green body called a prothallus. So the moss's gametophyte body that formed first was called a protonema, but this gametophyte is called a prothallus. Okay, and on the prothallus, on the underside, there's male and female parts. And these terms are the same as what they were for the moss. So there's the antheridium, or antheridia plural, which produce the sperm, and archegonia, or archegonium singular, which produce the eggs. So as long as there's some water, so rain or dew, that falls on it, then the sperm can swim. The sperm can swim to where the egg is. And so up out of the female part, so up out of the archegonium, we'd have fertilization inside of there to form the zygote. And then it'll start to undergo mitosis, becoming the embryo. And then it will grow up off of the, off of the prothallus to form an immature sporophyte, which is a fiddlehead. So some of you may have eaten fiddleheads before. So here's the fiddlehead that forms, and then when the time is right, it'll unfold and show its fronds. Mature sporophyte. Okay, these are little roots, so it has true roots, and then it has a rhizome, which is an underground stem. Okay, so this is the sporophyte generation, and this is the gametophyte generation, which produces the gametes. If we look at the graphic that you have, it's showing the same thing. Okay, so here's the sporophyte down here. On the underside of the fronds, you'll find the sorus, or sori, plural. They're clusters of sporangia, and inside of them, meiosis will happen to make haploid spores. The spores will fall on the ground and germinate into a gametophyte called a prothallus. And on the underside of that are the male and female parts. So this one has the egg in it. It would be the archegonium. This one has the sperm, so it would be the antheridium. The sperm, when there's water around, can swim and fertilize the egg. And then right in here would be where the zygote forms. And then mitosis will happen. Okay, so the zygote is diploid then. Mitosis will happen, so more divisions to form the early sporophyte. And then there'll be a fiddlehead in here. Oh, there's the fiddlehead. And that'll develop into the adult sporophyte with the fronds. Okay? And there's a description over on the left. So if you have any questions, please don't be scared to ask. That is the first two groups, the mosses and the ferns.